Yeah, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. A couple things there about my background uh, that was mentioned there on the previous slide, but just to sort of give a little bit more. Again, I was at Bank of America for 5 years. Before that, I was working in threat modeling for a number of years. I was an independent consultant for many years, helping many teams, small companies, mid-sized companies, and some large companies get started with threat modeling, start thinking about threat modeling, did a lot of training in threat modeling, again, as well as helping lots of teams. But when I went to the bank, it was a really interesting task to see the landscape, see what we're trying to do. Threat modeling had, as I understood it, about 10 years before, sort of started, but didn't quite get a good hold. And then over the years, it was something they mentioned a couple times, but really hadn't taken hold. And so when I came in, I actually started as a consultant just to put together some ideas, some approaches, consider some tools and things like that. And then a year later, came back and continued on as a full-time employee and stayed for another 4 or 5 years. And in that time, again, daunting prospect of looking at 10,000 plus products. Which ones do you work on? Which ones need threat models? How do you coordinate that? And then when you look at the products, some of these are very large. Some of these are a bit smaller. What do you focus on first, and so forth? And so a lot of that, again, is just about scoping, and as Duncan mentioned, that can certainly help you with scaling as well. Today, I work at Aquia, have been there for 2 years. We're working with a major government agency, and again, helping to start a threat modeling program there. And we've been putting together a number of threat models as well. But every organization is different. Every type of system and so forth is different. So some of the things we'll talk about today uh, apply to certain situations, and in some situations they may be a little bit different. So really, as was mentioned already, this is some food for thought, especially for discussion as we'll have afterward, to dig in. What are some things that this group has been seeing? So I'd love to hear from you and to share your experiences, and together we'll learn about ways to tackle this topic. So next slide. Yeah, next one. Okay, so let's just start at the top. Threat modeling. Um, I was one of the co-authors of the Threat Modeling Manifesto, and at the very beginning of that document, we have these 4 questions. So at its highest levels, when we threat model, we typically ask these 4 questions. What are we working on? What could go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good enough job? Now, you also may recognize Adam Shostak put these questions together a number of years ago in his threat modeling book, and then we had adapted it into the Threat Modeling Manifesto. Adam was also another co-author. Many times the focus of scoping is on that first question. What are we going to do? What are we working on? What are we concerned about? What's the scope here? Can we focus in on the type of things that we need to look at and what we're concerned about? And so another question is, do we need a threat model of a large system or just simply a single sprint change? And so those are some things that we want to explore a little bit today in this talk, and then plus also some more in the discussion following. Next slide. Now, this is a common term, but we typically say when anybody talks about scoping, and especially with threat modeling, you'll hear this phrase: avoid boiling the ocean. What do we mean by that, boiling the ocean? It's really one of those phrases that's been around for a while. A lot of business folks use that. But what does it mean? Boiling the ocean essentially means undertaking an impossible task or making a task unnecessarily difficult. And really what it comes from is this idea of it's literally impossible to boil the whole ocean. It's variously attributed to Will Rogers, Mark Twain, or Lewis Carroll. I sort of lean towards Lewis Carroll. There was one of his stories that he wrote. He talks about the sea, the possibility of the sea boiling, as well as alluding to pigs flying. That's another term we hear quite often. But what does it mean again is that we see the task before us and we say we're going to undertake it, but the reality is it's impossible to do everything, or it's unnecessarily more difficult than it should be. And sometimes when people get started with a threat modeling program or looking at several things to threat model, they can get overwhelmed. There's so much here. There's so many things that could happen. There's so many things that I need to think about. And so the first thing we really need to start to think about or try to think about is how can we scope this a little bit smaller, or start somewhere and start to divide the work, break down the work and so forth. So when we say avoid boiling the ocean, what we're trying to talk about is that tendency to scope too large for a threat model. Here's one example: a front-end application with thousands of microservices. Or, as I saw in my case, thousands of applications. And the first thing you want to do, especially as someone who is you bought into it, threat modeling is the greatest thing, and you say we got to threat model them all. But the reality is you can't. You won't be able to. And I mentioned here that something that we put in the threat modeling manifesto, this idea of admiration of the problem anti-pattern. You go beyond just analyzing the problem. What you want to do is reach for practical and relevant solutions. And so again, sometimes you can get overwhelmed. So take a step back. Let's try to look at what we have and figure out a better way to start to scope what we have. Next slide. So this is something I myself have shared a number of times in some of my own presentations, but I think it applies here as well, just to help folks who can feel overwhelmed. This is from an article by Ed Moyle back in 2017. Very few organizations will have the time or resources to threat model their entire ecosystem. Assuming you do not have that luxury, you still can realize quite a bit of value just by adopting the mindset of looking for blind spots and questioning assumptions. One thing that I do when I'm training for threat modeling is really, first of all, making sure that we understand threat modeling is a thinking tool. It's a way of thinking. It's a mindset. And as we help folks think about, as they look at their systems, as they look at what they need to be focused on, is really those 4 questions are helping us to uncover some of those blind spots. They're helping us to think about and question some of the assumptions that we've had. For example, that what could go wrong. Many times when we're developing a system or building a system, we think about what could go right, because we want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of customers. But when we're threat modeling, we're trying to think through a more secure design, making sure a system is more resilient, that it handles those cases where things could go wrong. And so that's where the blind spots could be. What are we missing here? And so helping people to think through those and build those kinds of skills, I think is really important. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about, when we have all of these number of things to look at and projects and so forth, existing products versus new development. Maybe for you, and certainly for myself, many times I've seen organizations as they get started with threat modeling, the first thing they want to do, or typically want to do, is take a look at what is already there. It makes sense. I mean, we've got lots of things here. We've got lots of products and projects and so forth. How do we know that we're secure? And typically, many companies already and organizations already have a lot of stuff that's already been built. So what do? We say, I've got hundreds of these, thousands of these. What do I do? Well, one approach, if you're considering that and looking at existing products, is to ask these questions. What products have the most exposure? Are there any that have external dependencies? And diagrams can help. If you put together data flow diagrams, I think are very useful. Architecture diagrams, other kinds of diagrams can help you identify some areas of concern to start to build out what's my scope in terms of the kinds of products I need to maybe consider threat modeling. In some cases, in some organizations, they may already have determined a level of risk for certain products. For example, some that are considered to be more high risk or critical. In other words, if this particular product was compromised in some way, it means everything to our organization. We will be in the news and that sort of thing. And so that might help as well to try to scope out which products, which things that we need to look at. So that's one approach. Another that I've seen done is simply to say, we need to consider, again, some of these risk levels, but also if something is going for deployment, for production, and maybe doing a spot check threat model, you can certainly do that. So those are existing products. That's a way, in some ways, to continue or consider other scoping. Now, my particular preference and what I advocate is more towards looking at new development. Certainly, if you follow the path of, let's take a look at some of these existing products as they have updates and so forth, then you're really focused on, again, making sure you have good design wherever you are. Figure out where you are, and then review those new features then. And that may also lead to some other areas that you need to review. But what you're doing is you're helping your scope. You're not maybe doing everything, but you're figuring out incrementally, what are the things I need to do that's new that might impact the security of the system. Also, for new development, you review big security decisions, either for those existing products or for new products, of course. If you have many APIs, you can consider Mozilla's rapid risk assessment approach. So if you're interested, go take a look. They basically, because they have tens of thousands of APIs that they were dealing with, microservices and so forth, their approach was to take a short assessment of an API that needs a change and ask questions about, does this impact the security in some way? Have we changed our attack surface in some way? And so on. And then from there, they would determine this API, if the answer was yes to those questions, they would say, then maybe we do need a larger threat model or a actual formal threat model review. And so it was a good way to say tens of thousands of APIs rather than look at every one of them. As changes happen, let's query those changes and validate that it makes sense to put together a threat model for this particular API or various API changes. So that's one approach. Another is just simply using agile or incremental threat modeling approaches. So agile, as you're working through stories and sprints, and you take a look at each story and think, is there any security implication here? Any changes that I need to think about? Should I consider asking those questions, the 4-question framework against this sprint? And if the answer is yes, we come out of that and say, yeah, there are some changes here, or there are some potential issues here, then maybe a threat model makes sense. Incremental threat modeling is an approach. We're going to cover that next month. Irene will be visiting to talk about that approach, incremental threat modeling, where you're, again, dividing and conquering and continuing, see where you are, continuing to build on your threat model as you go along. Now, some threat modeling manifesto patterns that can apply here is that systematic approach, varied viewpoints, and useful toolkit. I'm not mentioning the tool specifically here. tools can certainly help you with this, but ultimately any tool that you pick, you still have to make decisions about which product do I work on, which thing do I work on. And so some of these are a little bit outside of tools. Tools help, but you still have to make some of these decisions. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about versioning and deltas for threat models. So this is another way to help you divide and conquer. So versioning, the first thing we understand is that threat models are not static. I usually say to a team, start with a base threat model. Just review the system from a high-level view, understand the design. What are some parts of this that we need maybe think about later, but get a good high-level view. And then as you go along, create new versions per major features or large changes. Just recently, I was working with a team where they had a version 1 threat model that matched a version 1 of the system. Through various updates and changes and decisions, they decided that they needed to do a bit of a rewrite to that environment. And so they called it 2.0. And likewise, we said then you need a version 2.0 for your threat model. And what we looked at doing there was to consider what had been in version 1, because some of the design decisions that were in version 1 still applied to version 2, even though there was some rewrite and some changes in terms of language and so forth. Some of those design decisions were the same. They were still implementing the same thing, just slightly differently in another language. And so we brought some of those forward. Some other things they completely redid. And so again, we captured those in a version 2 threat model as well. And so those are some ways to help you move along with the changes of the product. But again, looking at those major features and large changes, and then versioning to help you know where we are, where it's going on, and again, helping you with the scope. Deltas help you determine the changes, and again, to manage those, determine what's new in the system versus the last time a threat model was created. In some cases, you may determine, maybe we don't need a full threat model here. Maybe this particular change or changes, we could just simply create a smaller threat model. And that sort of points to that anti-pattern that we put together in the threat modeling manifesto, that perfect representation. It's better to create multiple threat modeling representations because there is no single ideal view. And that may eliminate different problems. And so don't worry about needing to create smaller threat models of a single change. Remember, a threat model is a tool to help you design, to get better at design, to validate your design, to improve your design. And so a threat model is, again, just another tool to help you with some of those changes. And then you can move on. You can go back to your version and update that version, some things that you found. So there's some good ways here to break down the work even further to help you with your scope. Next slide. So conclusion, there's a lot more we could talk about, but I'm really excited to get into some of the discussion. Well, the first thing I want to mention is, don't be afraid of scoping. Threat modeling is too important not to do it. Don't get overwhelmed. There's so much work here. Don't be afraid of it. Find ways to break down a larger scope of work into smaller, more manageable slices of work, and then take your time. Threat models continue to evolve, as well as they continue to improve. You get better at it. You may say, my first threat model, I missed so many things. So did I. All of us have when we've built threat models, and then we continue to get better at it. We continue to find more things as we go along. And so take your time. They will continue to evolve. They will continue to improve. And again, figure out and focus on some ways to break down that larger scope, and you'll definitely be successful.
Well, thanks so much for that, Robert. I really appreciate your insight into how we can do that. So with that, let's go ahead and start into some discussion questions here.